For years, the veteran Nick Miller found his only peace in the quiet routines shared with his sole companion Toby, a retired service dog. But on one autumn morning, that routine was shattered. Toby, always the picture of discipline and obedience, suddenly ignored every command, his eyes filled with a strange urgency as he pulled Nick off the familiar trail. He led him to a place long forgotten, an old mine entrance nearly swallowed by trees and time. Deep inside the cold earth, Toby found not a wild animal, but something no one could have expected, a small, tarnished piece of metal. It was a child's silver bracelet, and engraved upon it was a name that had been the town's silent sorrow for the past 2 years. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The silence of a Pine Ridge morning was a language Nick Miller understood better than words. It was a silence filled with meaning, woven from the whisper of wind through 100-foot pines, the distant chatter of a squirrel, and the soft thud of his own heart. He sat on the porch of his Spartan cabin, a fortress of solitude built against the world, and watched the sun's first rays spill like liquid gold over the jagged peaks of the Colorado Rockies. Nick was a man carved from the same rugged landscape he called home. At 52, his tall frame was lean but carried the dense, wiry strength of a life lived on the edge. His brown hair, cut short in a way that never truly left the military, was surrendering to distinguished silver at the temples. A thick but neatly trimmed beard and mustache couldn't soften the hard lines etched around his eyes and mouth, lines that spoke of things seen and duties performed. Yet, within the harsh geography of his face, his eyes held a deep, weary kindness. He wore his daily uniform, a worn flannel shirt of navy blue, gray, and muted beige over a plain gray t-shirt, the fabric soft from countless washes. His jeans were faded to a pale blue, and on his feet were the same sturdy work boots he trusted to carry him through any terrain. Beside him, lying with a quiet dignity, was the only other soul who shared his world. Toby was a 9-year-old German shepherd, but to call him a pet would be an insult to their bond. He was a fellow veteran, his magnificent coat, a thick tapestry of salt and pepper gray with flashes of white on his chest and paws, was the only soft thing about him. His muzzle was frosted with the white of age, but his amber eyes were as sharp and intelligent as ever. He was a retired military working dog, a K-9 specialist in tracking, separated from service by the same piece of shrapnel that had left a faint, silvery scar above his left hip. They were 2 old soldiers, decommissioned by a world that no longer had a mission for them, who had found their final watch post here in the quiet embrace of the mountains. Nick took a slow sip of his black coffee, the steam fogging in the crisp autumn air. The ritual was the same every morning. Coffee on the porch, a silent communion with the mountains, then the long walk. Today, however, was different. Today, he would hunt, not for sport and not entirely for sustenance, but for the focus it demanded. The hunt was a mission, a clear objective that silenced the ghosts that whispered in the quiet moments. An hour later, they moved through the forest with the economy of motion that comes from years of practice. Nick's steps were silent, his breathing controlled. Toby moved ahead, a gray shadow gliding between the golden aspens and dark pines, his presence a silent assurance at Nick's flank. They were tracking a white-tailed doe, her tracks delicate and fresh in the damp earth. It was in a small clearing where the sun broke through the canopy in brilliant shafts of light that Nick saw her. The doe stood alone, her head raised, testing the wind. She was beautiful, graceful, and utterly vulnerable. And in that moment, the Colorado wilderness dissolved, the scent of pine and damp earth replaced by the smell of dust and sun-baked mud. The year was 2009, the place a village outside Kandahar. The image hit him not as a memory, but as a physical blow. The sun was a hammer, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and fear. He wasn't holding a rifle, he was holding the hand of a small Afghan girl, no older than 8, her other hand clutching a bright red kite. She was alone, separated from her family in the chaos. He had promised to get her to the safe zone. Her name was Anila. He remembered the feel of her small, trusting hand in his. He remembered the brilliant, defiant red of her kite against the dusty brown landscape. He remembered the high-pitched whine that came a second before the world turned to fire and noise. He remembered seeing that red kite, torn and broken, lying in the street afterward. "Nick." The voice was his own, a ragged whisper torn from his throat. He blinked, and the Afghan sun retreated, replaced by the dappled light of the Colorado forest. The doe was gone. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of failure. He leaned against a pine tree, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the rifle in his hand suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. Toby was instantly at his side, no longer a scout, but a sentry, pressing his solid weight against Nick's leg. The dog whined softly, a low thrum of concern, and nudged Nick's hand with his wet nose. It was the anchor Nick needed. "I'm okay, boy," he murmured, scratching the dog's head. "I'm okay." But he wasn't. The ghosts were loud today. The hunt was over. The focus he'd sought had shattered. Now he needed a new mission, something to outrun the memories. His mind latched onto something he'd heard from Old Man Henderson at the general store weeks ago. Stories and local rumors about the old Whispering Mine, a long-abandoned shaft deep in the less-traveled part of the national forest. A place folks said was haunted, a place to be avoided, a perfect destination. "Come on, Toby," Nick said, his voice regaining its strength. "Let's go see about some ghosts." They changed direction, heading deeper into the woods, toward the rugged hills where the old mines were carved into the mountainside. For the first mile, Toby trotted at his side, content to follow. But as they neared the area Henderson had described, the dog's demeanor changed. It was a shift Nick knew intimately. He'd seen it 100 times in the field. Toby's ears swiveled forward, locking onto something unseen. His relaxed trot tightened into a stiff, purposeful walk. His tail, usually held in a gentle curve, lowered and became rigid. His nose, which had been casually sampling the forest's buffet of smells, now pointed to the ground, twitching, utterly fixated. This was not the behavior of a dog who had caught the scent of a squirrel or a bear. This was Toby the operator, the canine specialist on a mission. Nick stopped and knelt beside him. "What is it, boy? What have you got?" Toby ignored him, his entire being consumed by the scent. He pulled forward, his powerful shoulders straining against the silence. Nick followed, intrigued. He trusted Toby's instincts more than he trusted his own. The dog led him away from the barely there trail, pushing through thickets of thorny bushes and over moss-covered rocks. The air here was cooler, heavy with the smell of damp stone. As Nick concentrated, he could smell it too. It was incredibly faint, almost lost beneath the scents of pine needles and decaying leaves. It was the smell of humanity, but stale and old, mingled with the metallic tang of the earth. It was a smell that did not belong here. Toby's excitement grew, turning into a low, controlled whine. He wasn't just tracking now, he was closing in. He led Nick to a sheer rock face, a wall of granite and overgrown ivy that looked impenetrable. A lesser eye would have seen nothing but a cliff. But Toby didn't stop. He pawed at a thick curtain of ancient ivy and tangled roots, whining with more urgency. Nick pushed the heavy vegetation aside. Behind it, like a secret waiting to be told, was a dark, narrow opening. A wooden frame, rotten and crumbling, was all that was left of what was once a mine entrance. The darkness within was absolute, seeming to swallow the autumn light. The air that seeped out was cold and carried that same faint, wrong scent. Toby stood at the entrance, not barking, but emitting a low, steady growl from deep in his chest. His hackles were raised. He was on guard, alerting his handler that they had found something. Something that had been hidden for a very, very long time. The soldier in Nick took over before the man could hesitate. His first instinct was to establish security. He placed a firm hand on Toby's neck, murmuring a low, steady command. "Easy, boy. Stand down. Watch." Toby's growl subsided into a low, watchful rumble, the sound vibrating through Nick's hand. The dog obeyed, but his body remained a coiled spring of tension, his intelligent eyes fixed on the dark maw of the mine. Nick trusted that tension. It meant the threat, or the memory of it, was real. Ignoring the entrance for a moment, Nick's gaze swept the immediate area in a practiced, methodical arc. His mind, once clouded by the ghosts of Kandahar, was now sharp and clear, processing details with the cold efficiency of a threat assessment. The rumors Old Man Henderson had shared were just stories. This was tangible. His eyes caught on a patch of disturbed soil near a cluster of ferns. He knelt, his knees barely making a sound on the damp ground. There, faint but undeniable, was the partial print of a small shoe, its edges softened by seasons of rain, but its shape still visible to a trained eye. It was old? He scanned further. A low-hanging branch on a chokecherry bush was broken. The wood inside faded to a pale gray, suggesting the break was old, but it was snapped downward, cleanly, not twisted and frayed by wind or a heavy snow load. It was the mark of someone pushing their way through the foliage in a hurry, someone smaller than him. The pieces clicked into place with a grim certainty. This wasn't a haunted mine, it was a place someone had been. Someone had been brought here. With his flashlight in hand, a heavy-duty beam that could cut through the densest night, Nick gave Toby a quiet command. Forward! The dog moved into the opening without hesitation, Nick right behind him. The sudden transition from the bright autumn day to the profound darkness was disorienting. The air changed instantly, becoming heavy, cold, and stripped of life. It tasted of damp stone, wet rot, and that faint underlying scent of old sorrows. The beam from his flashlight sliced through the blackness, revealing a narrow, timber-supported tunnel that descended into the earth. The silence in here was different from the forest's peace. It was a dead, oppressive weight that seemed to absorb sound. Toby didn't pause. He moved with purpose down the main shaft, ignoring a smaller, collapsed tunnel to the left. His claws clicked softly on the rocky floor. Nick followed, his boots making a heavier, more deliberate sound. He swept his light from side to side, noting the damp, glistening walls and the debris of a century of neglect. About 50 yards in, the tunnel opened into a slightly larger chamber where the original miners had followed a vein of ore. A pile of rotting timbers lay in one corner, and rusted tools were scattered on the ground, artifacts of a forgotten time. It was here that Toby became agitated. He veered into a recess in the rock wall, a small alcove barely large enough for a person to lie down in. It was the most sheltered spot in the chamber, hidden from the direct line of sight of the entrance. The dog began to whine, a high-pitched sound of distress, and started digging frantically at the loose dirt and rock at the base of the wall. Paws moved in a blur, sending pebbles and soil flying. "Toby, hold," Nick commanded, his voice sharp but not angry. The dog stopped, panting heavily, looking back at Nick with an expression of desperate urgency. Nick knelt in the tight space, the beam of his flashlight focused on the spot Toby had indicated. He saw nothing but disturbed earth. But Toby had never been wrong. Nick holstered his flashlight, took off his gloves, and began to dig with his bare hands. The ground was cold and damp. His fingers brushed against something hard and cool. It wasn't a rock. Carefully, he excavated the object. It was small, metallic, and caked with dirt. He wiped it clean against the rough fabric of his jeans. It was a child's bracelet, a delicate silver chain, now tarnished with a dark patina. A small, flat plate was attached to it. He angled it into the flashlight's beam. Engraved on the silver in a simple, looped script was a single word: Robin. The name hung in the dead air of the mine, a silent scream. And as Nick stared at it, the silver seemed to grow cold in his hand, a cold that seeped into his bones and straight into his memory. The mine, the darkness, the child's token. It was all a terrible echo. The image of the red kite faded, replaced by another from that same day in Kandahar. After the dust had settled, after the screaming had stopped, he had walked through the rubble. and in the debris he had found a small, hand-carved wooden bird, its paint chipped, its wings broken. He had picked it up, knowing it must have belonged to Anila. It was so small, so innocent, a fragile piece of a life that had just been extinguished. He had held it in his palm, and its uselessness, its inability to turn back time, had crushed him. Now, holding this bracelet, he felt the exact same weight, the same cold finality. Another token of a lost child, another life he had been too late to find. His breath caught in his throat, and for a second the darkness in the mine was nothing compared to the darkness flooding his own mind. But then something else rose through the grief. Not despair, but a cold, hard resolve. The wooden bird had been an epilogue to a tragedy. This bracelet felt different. Toby had found it. He had found it. It felt like a mission briefing, a call to action. He looked at the name again. Robin. He didn't know who she was, but he knew with every fiber of his being that her story would not end the same way as Anila's. Not if he could help it. He stood up, his movements stiff. He placed the bracelet carefully in his pocket. "Good boy, Toby," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Good find." He backed out of the mine, his mind already working, cataloging, planning. The haunted man who had entered the woods that morning was gone. The soldier had returned, not to fight an enemy abroad, but to wage war against a ghost at home. Once outside, he walked until his phone showed a single bar of service. He scrolled through his contacts and pressed the name he knew he could trust. It rang twice before a calm, familiar voice answered. "Tom Jenkins." "Tom, it's Nick Miller." There was a slight pause, then warmth entered the sheriff's voice. "Nick, good to hear from you. Everything all right up there on your mountain?" "Not exactly," Nick said, his tone flat and professional, devoid of any small talk. "I'm in the old forest sector, north of the Black Creek tributary. I found something at the Whispering Mine." The warmth in Sheriff Jenkins' voice vanished, replaced by the crisp authority of a lawman. "What did you find?" "Signs of long-term habitation and a piece of personal property. A child's silver bracelet with the name Robin engraved on it." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with meaning. The name Robin was infamous in this county. A little girl who had vanished from a local park 2 years ago. The case had gone cold, leaving a permanent scar on the community. "Are you certain, Nick?" Tom's voice was low. "I am." "All right, read me your coordinates. Exactly." Nick did, his voice steady. "Okay," Tom said. "I'm on my way. Do not go back in there. Do not touch anything else. Secure the area and wait for me. I'll be there as fast as I can." "Understood," Nick replied. "And Nick?" "Yeah?" "Thanks." The line went dead. Nick slid the phone back into his pocket. He looked at the dark entrance to the mine, then at Toby, who had taken up a seated position at his side, watching the trail, his ears pricked forward. They were on watch again, 2 old soldiers guarding a sacred, terrible place. A new mission had begun, and this time, failure was not an option. The wait was a familiar state for Nick. He had spent a significant portion of his life waiting, for orders, for an extraction, for the tension of a mission to finally break. He and Toby stood sentry at the edge of the trees, a silent 2-man unit watching the path. The sun had climbed higher, but a permanent chill seemed to emanate from the dark mouth of the mine. The first to arrive was Sheriff Tom Jenkins. His county SUV navigated the rough, unpaved track with a practiced ease. Tom was a man in his late 50s, broad-shouldered and solid, with a weathered face that spoke of a lifetime spent under the Colorado sun. His uniform was crisp, but his demeanor was that of a man who knew his people and his territory intimately. He got out of the vehicle, and his eyes immediately found Nick. "Nick," he said, his voice low as he approached. He gave Toby a respectful nod. "You holding up?" "I'm fine, Tom," Nick replied, his voice level. "The scene is untouched, just as you said." Tom's gaze went to the hidden mine entrance, and a heavy sigh escaped him. Robin Miller. I was a deputy when that call came in. 2 years ago. We searched these woods for months. He looked back at Nick, his expression grim. Never thought we'd be back here for this. Before they could say more, the sound of other vehicles grew louder. The FBI had arrived. 2 black SUVs, clinical and imposing, pulled up behind the sheriff's truck. Doors opened, and a team of people emerged, moving with a quiet, focused energy that instantly transformed the clearing from a patch of wilderness into a federal crime scene. Leading them was Detective Sarah Reed. She was in her late 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a severe, practical ponytail. She was dressed for the field in dark cargo pants, boots, and a navy blue jacket with 3 bold yellow letters stitched on the back. Her face was sharp and intelligent, her movements precise. She carried an air of contained intensity, of a mind that was already several steps ahead of everyone else. She conferred briefly with Tom, her eyes scanning the area, cataloging every detail, before she approached Nick. "Mr. Miller," she said. Her voice was clear and professional, without warmth, but also without condescension. "I'm Detective Reed. Thank you for your call. We appreciate your diligence in preserving the scene." She looked him over, her sharp gaze taking in his rugged appearance and the watchful dog at his side. He was a piece of the puzzle, a key witness, but nothing more. "Sheriff Jenkins has vouched for you, but I'll need you to walk me through your discovery step by step. Then, my team will need the area clear." Nick recounted the events of the morning, his report as concise and factual as if he were debriefing a commanding officer. He spoke of Toby's behavior, the subtle signs at the entrance, and the discovery of the bracelet. He omitted the flashbacks, the raw emotion. Those were not relevant to the mission. He handed her the small plastic bag into which he had placed the bracelet. Detective Reed listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. Your cooperation is noted. We'll take it from here." With a nod, she turned away, and the full force of the investigation was unleashed. A mobile command unit was set up, yellow tape was unspooled, cordoning off the mine and a wide perimeter around it. A forensic team, clad in white Tyvek suits that made them look like astronauts on an alien world, began their meticulous work. Nick and Toby retreated to the edge of the newly established perimeter, watching the controlled chaos. Nick felt a familiar sense of detachment. He had done his part. The professionals were in charge now. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. They were searching for fingerprints, for fibers, for DNA, the tiny microscopic clues that would build a case. But Nick's training wasn't about what a person left behind. It was about how a person survived. He watched a young forensic tech photograph the chamber where he had found the bracelet. The tech was thorough, his camera's flash illuminating the recess again and again, but his focus was on the ground, on the disturbed soil. Nick's eyes were drawn higher up the rock wall. "Tom," he said quietly, as the sheriff came over to check on him. "What is it, Nick?" "That recess. Tell them to look at the walls, not just the floor." Tom frowned. "What for?" "Just tell them," Nick insisted. Tom trusted Nick's instincts. He relayed the message to Detective Reed. She gave Nick a brief, questioning glance from across the clearing, but complied, speaking into her radio. A moment later, Nick saw the tech in the white suit redirect his light onto the rock walls of the alcove. Nick also pointed to a spot higher up in the main chamber. "And that fissure up there," he told Tom. "Near the ceiling. It looks like a natural crack, but it's not. The edges are too clean on the inside." This time, Detective Reed walked over herself, her arms crossed. "What am I supposed to be looking at, Mr. Miller?" "That crack in the rock," Nick said, pointing. "It's an air vent, a natural one probably, but someone's widened it from the inside, chipped away at it to improve the airflow. You don't do that for a short stay. You do that when you're planning to be somewhere for a long time." He then gestured back toward the recess. "And in the alcove, look for a pattern in the way the smaller rocks are placed near the base of the wall. It's not a random pile, it's a catchment. There's a slow water drip from the ceiling there. Someone arranged those stones to channel the water, to create a small, clean pool to drink from. Jar, Detective Reed stared at him, her professional mask finally cracking with a flicker of something else. Surprise, maybe even respect. These were not the observations of a simple witness. This was the analysis of a survivor. She spoke into her radio again, her instructions now more specific. I want forensics to examine the fissure near the ceiling for tool marks, and in the recess, check the rock pile for signs of deliberate placement. Take water samples from any pooled liquid and swab the surrounding rocks for DNA. She turned back to Nick, her gaze now direct and searching. You've spent time in places like this? It wasn't a question. I have, Nick said simply. They stood in silence for the next 20 minutes. Then the voice of the forensic team leader crackled over Reed's radio. Detective, you were right. We have tool marks on the fissure. Looks like it was widened with a small rock hammer or a similar object, and the rocks in the alcove were definitely arranged deliberately. We found trace DNA consistent with saliva on the stones around the water pool. Someone was living in here for a long time. A heavy silence fell between them. The technical findings confirmed what Nick's instincts had told him. This wasn't just a place where Robin Miller had been. It was a place where she had survived, day after day, week after week. Detective Reed's entire demeanor toward Nick had changed. The professional distance was gone, replaced by a focused collaboration. What else do you see? She asked, her voice low. The search had now become a reconstruction of a life lived in darkness. The evidence they found painted a heartbreaking picture. Scratches on the wall, hidden behind a loose rock, formed a crude calendar of more than 700 marks. A small pile of tattered blankets, faded wrappers from granola bars that had been discontinued over a year ago. Every discovery confirmed two terrible truths. Robin had been kept alive in this cold, dark hole for at least 2 years, and she was no longer here. The lack of any recent evidence, the age of the food wrappers, the undisturbed dust in most of the cave, it all pointed to the fact that she had been moved. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Detective Reed stood beside Nick, looking at the yellow tape cordoning off the mine. The initial frantic energy of the investigation had settled into a grim, methodical process. 2 years, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Her parents held a memorial service last spring. Most of the town believed she was gone. She looked at Nick. Today, you gave them the first piece of real hope they've had since she disappeared. Nick didn't feel like he had delivered hope. He felt like he had only confirmed the depth of a nightmare. He looked past the crime scene, past the flashing lights of the official vehicles, and into the vast, darkening wilderness that stretched out in every direction. The mine was just the beginning. Robin was out there, somewhere in these mountains, and the ghost of 2 years felt like it was finally beginning to stir. The hours bled into one another in the cold, sterile light of the FBI's forensic lamps. The mine had become a silent, hollow stage where a 2-year-old tragedy was being painstakingly dissected. The forensic team worked with a quiet reverence, their white suits moving like ghosts through the chamber, but the mood was turning grim. They had collected fibers, taken soil samples, and documented every inch of the space, but the trail was old. The evidence confirmed a long-term presence, but offered little about where Robin might be now. Nick stood near the entrance, just outside the yellow tape, with Toby lying patiently at his feet. He watched the meticulous process, his mind a battlefield of hope and dread. He felt the familiar pull of helplessness, of being a spectator to a battle he desperately wanted to fight. His gaze kept returning to the small recess where he had found the bracelet, where the team had already taken samples and photographs. Something was nagging at him, a detail that didn't fit. Near the tattered pile of blankets, there was a single flat stone about the size of a dinner plate leaning against the wall. It looked like part of the natural debris, but it was positioned at an odd angle. It wasn't lying flat like the other rocks that had flaked off the ceiling over the years. It was propped up. It was deliberate. He waited for Detective Reed to emerge from the mine for a brief consultation with her team leader. "Detective," he said, his voice low enough not to carry. She turned to him, her expression weary, but still sharp. "Mr. Miller?" "The alcove," he said, nodding toward the mine. "There's a flat stone leaning against the back wall near the bedding area. It's not a natural fall. It's been placed there." Reed's eyes narrowed slightly. Her team was looking for microscopic evidence, not studying the cave's geology. But she had learned in the last few hours to respect the veteran's eye for things that were out of place. Without a word, she turned and spoke into her radio, relaying Nick's observation. Nick watched as one of the forensic techs, a young man with careful hands, approached the stone. He photographed it from several angles before gently moving it aside. Behind it, tucked into a small, dark crevice in the rock, was a bundle wrapped in what looked like oilskin, or perhaps a thick plastic bag secured with twine. A hush fell over the clearing. The tech carefully placed the bundle into a sterile evidence container and brought it out of the mine. Inside the brightly lit mobile command unit, the air was thick with anticipation. Detective Reed, Nick, and Sheriff Jenkins stood around a stainless steel table as the forensic team leader, a man named Davies with graying hair and practiced hands, began to work. He cut the twine and carefully unfolded the waterproof wrapping. Inside was a simple spiral notebook, the kind a child would use for school. Its cover depicted a cartoon unicorn prancing under a rainbow. The pages were warped and swollen from the persistent dampness, but it was largely intact. "It's a diary," Reed breathed. Davies opened it with the gentle precision of a surgeon. On the first page, in the large, looping handwriting of a young child, were the words, "The Story of the Princess in the Dark Cave," by Robin Miller. What followed was not just a collection of evidence. It was, as the summary had foretold, a gateway into a child's soul. Detective Reed began to read some of the entries aloud, her professional voice softening with a raw, undisguised emotion. The early entries were filled with a stark, simple terror. "Day 30, I think. The Shadow King told me today that nobody is looking for me anymore. He said my mom and dad have a new daughter now. I told him he was a liar, but when he's gone, the dark whispers that maybe he's right. The dark is hungry. It eats all the happy thoughts." Nick felt a cold fist clench in his stomach. He saw Anila's face, her trusting eyes. This was the weapon of the captor, not just chains, but the slow, methodical erosion of hope. But then the tone of the diary began to change. Interspersed between the entries of fear were new chapters in a different story. Day 120, maybe. The princess in the dark cave was not afraid today. She knows a secret. She knows the Queen of Light is coming for her. The Queen is the most powerful in the land. She has hair like the sun and eyes like the sky, and she carries a sword made of moonbeams that can cut through any shadow. The Shadow King builds his walls of stone and lies, but he cannot stop the Queen of Light. She is on her way. Reed paused, looking up at Nick. "Her mother's name is Eleanor," she said softly. "She has blonde hair and blue eyes." The diary was Robin's shield, her sword. Unable to fight back physically, she had waged a war in her imagination. She had transformed her mother into a mythical hero, her captor into a fairy tale villain, and herself into a princess whose rescue was not just a hope, but a certainty. This notebook was the testament of a spirit that refused to be extinguished. Nick listened, his throat tight. He, too, had a Shadow King, a ghost of failure that lived in the dark corners of his mind. He had fought it with isolation, with routine, with the disciplined silence of the mountains. This child had fought it with a story, with the pure, unwavering power of a daughter's love for her mother. Her resilience was both a revelation and a reprimand. Davies carefully turned another fragile page. The fantasy continued, growing more detailed, more vibrant, a world of light built in defiance of the all-consuming dark. Day 400, I guess. Today the Shadow King was angry. His voice was like rocks grinding together. But I didn't cry. I closed my eyes and I saw the Queen of Light riding on her great white horse, Silverwind. They were crossing the Sea of Sorrows to get to me. The Queen told me to be brave. She said that even in the darkest cave, a single candle can light the way home. I am her candle. Finally, they reached the last entry. The handwriting was different. It was rushed, shaky, the pencil pressing hard into the page. The date at the top simply said, "The day the mountain cried." The thunder is a monster, and it's trying to break the mountain. The walls are crying. The Shadow King is scared. I can hear it in his voice. He keeps looking at the water coming in. It's a little river now, on the floor. He said we have to go. He said the mountain is angry, and we have to leave the gray castle forever. He is packing things in a hurry. He is yelling, "I am scared, but I am also not." Maybe this is it. Maybe the Queen of Light sent the storm to break down the walls. That was the end. The next page was blank. The flash floods, Sheriff Jenkins said, his voice heavy with realization. There was a brutal storm system that stalled over this range late that spring, about 3 months ago, caused mudslides all over the county. It would have flooded this mine in a matter of hours. The final piece fell into place. The storm had been their salvation and their curse. It had forced the kidnapper to move Robin, but in his haste, he had not known, or not cared, about the diary Robin had so carefully hidden. It was the one mistake he had made. Detective Reed closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing it all. When she opened them, her professional focus was back, but it was now fueled by a fierce, personal fire. She looked at Nick, no longer seeing just a witness, but a kindred spirit in this new mission. "He was forced out," she said. "He had to move her in a panic. That means he may have gotten careless." She looked at the diary, now carefully sealed in an evidence bag. "This child fought for her own sanity for 2 years in the dark. She left us a map of her soul." Nick nodded, his gaze distant. He wasn't just looking for a missing girl named Robin anymore. He was looking for the princess in the dark cave. He was joining the Queen of Light. He was going to help her find her candle and bring her home. The Mobile Command Unit, a hub of cutting-edge technology and federal efficiency, had run into a wall made of crayon and a child's imagination. On a large digital display, a high-resolution scan of the last page of Robin's diary was projected. It was a drawing, a map born from the mind of a princess trapped in a dark tower. A crude, lopsided castle with a frowning face in the window was labeled Castle of the Gray-Bearded Giant. From it, a winding, jagged path filled with scary-looking squiggles was named The Trail of Fear. For 3 hours, Detective Reed and her team of analysts had tried to force logic upon it. They had overlaid it on topographical surveys, run software to identify geological formations that might resemble a castle, and cross-reference the drawing with every known structure in a 50-mile radius. The result was always the same: nothing. "It's a fantasy," one of the analysts, a young man named Carter, said, rubbing his tired eyes. "The geographic markers are inconsistent. The scale is impossible. It's a drawing of how she felt, not what she saw." Detective Reed stared at the screen, her arms crossed, her jaw tight with frustration. He was right. Her entire career was built on evidence, on data, on the cold, hard lines of fact. This map had none. It was a dead end, a final heartbreaking cry from a little girl that they were powerless to interpret. Nick had been sitting quietly in a corner of the unit, Toby's head resting on his boot. He had listened to the technical jargon, the failed attempts to impose order on a child's narrative of survival. He understood their frustration, but he knew they were asking the wrong questions. They were trying to read a map of the world. He knew this was a map of a soul. "Detective," he said, his voice calm in the tense room. "Can I see it again? The original?" Reed looked at him, a flicker of desperation in her eyes. She nodded to Davies, the forensic lead, who carefully brought the notebook, now encased in a protective sleeve, over to a smaller table. Nick stood over the drawing, his large, calloused finger tracing the lines without touching the page. He wasn't looking at it like an analyst. He was looking at it with the empathy of a fellow prisoner, someone who also knew what it was like to be trapped in a world of fear, battling giants of the mind. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to see the mountains not as a veteran or a hunter, but as an 8-year-old girl, the castle of the gray-bearded giant. The team had looked for structures. Nick looked for people. Who in these mountains was a giant? Not in size, but in presence. Someone reclusive, intimidating, a figure of local legend who lived apart from the world. A man a child would see as an ogre in a fairy tale. His eyes opened. Hemlock, he said, the name a quiet revelation. Reed turned to him. What? There's a man. We call him Old Man Hemlock. His real name is Jedediah Stone, Nick explained, his mind working quickly. He's a recluse, a survivalist, lives in a remote cabin he built himself decades ago, has a long, wild gray beard. He almost never comes to town. The local kids tell stories about him. They say he's a giant who lives in the woods. Sheriff Jenkins, who had been listening intently, nodded in confirmation. Jedediah Stone. He's a strange one, but he's kept to himself. No record to speak of, besides telling a few hikers to get off his land. But his cabin? It's one of the most isolated in the county. Reed's focus sharpened. This was the first tangible lead they'd had. And the trail? She asked, pointing to the drawing. The Trail of Fear? If you want to get to Hemlock's cabin, there are 2 ways, Nick continued, his confidence growing. The long way, which is a 10-mile hike on a marked path, or the shortcut. He pointed to a section on the large topographical map on the wall. Right here, you follow the Black Creek tributary. It's not a trail. The creek bed is shallow, full of slick, moss-covered boulders and sudden drops. It's treacherous. Locals know to avoid it. For a child forced to walk it, especially in the dark, it would be a trail of fear. The room was silent. Nick's logic was not based on data, but on a profound intuitive understanding of the story Robin was trying to tell. He had translated her fear into geography. It's a theory, Mr. Miller, Reed said, her voice cautious. A compelling one, but it's based on a child's drawing and a local nickname. She's not giving you coordinates, Detective, Nick said, his gaze unwavering. She's telling you a story. You have to listen to the story. Reed held his gaze for a long moment. Everything in her training told her this was a long shot. But everything in her gut and the quiet certainty in the veteran's eyes told her it was the only shot they had. All right, she said, making a decision. Let's listen to the story. Gear up. We're going to pay a visit to the giant's castle. The journey to the cabin was tense. They couldn't risk a full tactical approach that might be seen or heard from miles away. Reed opted for a small, quiet team, herself, Nick, Tom, and 2 of her most experienced agents. Toby, of course, came with them. As they left the vehicles and began to navigate the treacherous creek bed, every slippery stone and steep, difficult climb served as a confirmation of Nick's theory. This was, without a doubt, a trail of fear. After an hour of grueling progress, they saw it through the trees. The cabin was exactly as Nick had described it, a small, sturdy structure of dark, weathered logs, almost blending into the forest around it. A thin plume of smoke curled from its stone chimney. Someone was home, or had been very recently. They approached with the silence of ghosts, weapons ready, every sense on high alert. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. At Reed's signal, the team stormed the cabin, a fluid, practiced breach that took less than 3 seconds. Clear, one of the agents called from inside. The cabin was empty, but the air was still warm from the embers dying in the hearth. On a crude wooden table, a bowl of oatmeal sat half-eaten, a spoon still resting in it. The porridge was cold, but it hadn't been sitting there for long. A small cot in the corner was unmade, the indentation of a small body still visible in the rough wool blanket. And lying on the pillow was a small, hand-carved wooden bird. The sight of it hit Nick like a physical blow. It was nearly identical to the one he had found in the rubble in Kandahar. His breath hitched. This was a message he understood on a level no one else could. They were close, so painfully, terrifyingly close. Davies, who had come with the team, did a quick test of the embers in the fireplace. He looked up at Reed, his face pale. The fire's been out for less than 2 days, maybe 24 hours. The reality of the situation descended on them all. They hadn't just found a new location, they had just missed them. Robin had been here yesterday, or the day before. The cold case had just become a live pursuit. The ghost of 2 years had become a flesh-and-blood fugitive, and the hunt, Nick knew with a chilling certainty, had just become hotter and more desperate than ever before. The warmth in the cabin's air was a taunt. It was the ghost of a presence, proof that they were hours, maybe only a single day, behind their quarry. For a law enforcement professional like Sarah Reed, it was an agonizingly close miss. For a man like Nick, who saw a small carved bird on an empty cot, it was a torment. "He'll be back," Nick said, his voice a low growl that was almost a mirror of Toby's. He stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the dense woods surrounding the cabin. "This place is a homestead, not just a hideout. There are supplies here, tools. He left in a hurry. He didn't take everything he needs. He'll be back." Detective Reed came to the same conclusion. "No one leaves," she commanded, speaking into her radio. "Establish a perimeter, concealed observation posts, radio silence. We're not searching anymore. We're hunting." The next hours were a masterclass in patience and tension. Nick, Toby, and 2 FBI agents took up a position on a small rise overlooking the cabin, melting into the undergrowth with a practiced stillness. For Nick, the experience was deeply familiar. The waiting, the watching, the absolute focus on a single sector. It was the core of his old life. But now, the objective wasn't a hostile combatant. It was a little girl's monster. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, a figure emerged from the tree line. It was him, Robin's gray-bearded giant. Jedediah Stone was a man who seemed to have been grown from the mountain itself. He was tall and broad, with a powerful frame that filled out his rough canvas coat. His hair and beard were a wild, tangled mane of iron gray spilling down over his chest. He moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, carrying a rifle in one hand and a freshly caught rabbit in the other. But it was his eyes that held Nick's attention. They were pale, almost colorless, and burned with the cold, unwavering fire of the zealot. He was not a man hiding from the world. He was a man who had rejected it. Toby, lying flat beside Nick, didn't bark. A low, barely audible growl rumbled in his chest, a signal only Nick could feel through the ground. The team was alerted. They waited, letting him get closer, letting him believe his sanctuary was still secure. He was 20 yards from the cabin door when Reed's voice cut through the twilight stillness. "FBI, drop the weapon, Jedediah. Hands where I can see them." The man froze. For a single, tense second, his eyes darted to the woods, calculating his chances. Then, as agents materialized from the shadows, their weapons trained on him, he seemed to make a decision. With a look not of fear, but of profound disappointment, he slowly placed the rifle on the ground and raised his empty hands. The takedown was swift and silent. Within moments, Jedediah Stone was in handcuffs, his face a mask of serene composure. He did not struggle. He did not shout. He simply watched them, a king observing the foolish games of lesser beings. They sat him on a stump in the clearing as the team conducted a search of his person. Reed stood before him, her expression a cold mask of professional fury. "Where is she, Jedediah?" she asked, her voice cutting through the air. "Where is Robin Miller?" A slow, pitying smile spread across Jedediah's face, cracking the weathered landscape of his features. He looked past Reed, at the agents, at the encroaching darkness. "You speak a name from the broken world," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "That name has no meaning here. We are not her captors. We are her saviors." "Save the sermon," Reed snapped. "You have kidnapped a child. You've held her for 2 years. Tell me where she is now, and it will go better for you." Jedediah chuckled, a dry, rustling sound like dead leaves. "Better for me? You think your world's judgment means anything to me? You live in a cage of noise and poison and lies, and you call it freedom. You hand your children screens that rot their minds and feed them food that sickens their bodies, and you call it love." He leaned forward slightly, his pale eyes burning with intensity. "We have removed her from the poison. We are giving her the gift of purity, the gift of silence, the gift of the earth. She is being reborn." Nick stood nearby, listening, his hands clenched into fists. He was staring at the Shadow King from Robin's diary. This wasn't just a kidnapper. This was a man who had built a fortress of philosophy around his own madness. He was unreachable by logic or threats. "There were others with you," Reed stated, changing tactics. "Who are they?" Jedediah's smile widened. "There are others who see the sickness, others who are willing to do what is necessary to save the innocent. You will not find them. They know the mountains in a way you never will." He looked directly at Nick then, his gaze dismissive. "Even your soldier there. He has learned to survive in the wilderness, but he still serves the cage. He doesn't understand what it means to be free of it." As the agents prepared to transport Jedediah, a sudden chilling realization dawned on Sarah Reed. She looked at her watch, then at the darkening sky. Jedediah had come back to the cabin for a reason. He was expected somewhere else, with someone else. "He was on a supply run," she said, her voice barely audible, speaking more to herself than to anyone else. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with a new and terrible urgency. She turned to Nick and the rest of the team. "He was supposed to return," she said, the pieces falling into place with sickening speed. "He had a schedule, a rendezvous. When he doesn't show up, they'll know. They'll know he's been caught. They'll know we're here." A wave of cold dread washed over Nick. Jedediah's capture wasn't the end of a chapter. It was the starting pistol for the real race. His accomplices were out there, with Robin, and their alarm bell had just been rung. Sarah Reed's voice became sharp, ringing with command, cutting through the night. "This is no longer a methodical search of a cold case," she announced to her team, her voice crackling over the radio. "This is a live pursuit. Our clock started the moment we put handcuffs on him. They will run, and they will take her with them. Our new mission is to find her before she disappears forever." The hunt had become a race against time. The ticking of the clock was now as loud and insistent as the frantic beating of Nick's own heart. The ticking clock was a hammer in the silence of the command unit. Every minute that passed felt like a victory for the fugitives and another step toward failure for the search team. Jedediah Stone's capture had given them a prisoner, but had also lit a fire under his accomplices, sending them scattering into the vast, unforgiving wilderness with Robin. Their first and only lead had come from a frantic search of Jedediah's cabin. Tucked inside an old book about herbal remedies, they had found a hand-drawn map. It was more literal than Robin's, marking a trail to a spot by a river bend, labeled simply Camp. Hope, sharp and desperate, had surged through the team. "It could be a trap," Reed had warned, though her voice was tight with urgency. "But it's all we have. We move." The journey to the campsite was a frantic, punishing trek. They moved with speed and purpose, the hope of finding Robin just around the next bend, driving them forward. They found the site exactly where the map indicated, and their hope died there. The place was a ruin. A tattered piece of canvas was rotted to the ground, the remnants of a lean-to. The fire pit was filled with old, rain-soaked ash, and the ground was littered with rusted cans and debris. A quick assessment by the forensic team confirmed their fears. The site hadn't been used in at least a year. It was a decoy, a ghost camp. Jedediah, or his accomplice, had left the map deliberately, a final act of mockery designed to send them on a fool's errand. The hike back was silent and heavy. The weight of the wasted hours pressed down on them. They had lost precious time, perhaps the only window of opportunity they had. Back in the mobile command unit, a profound sense of despair had taken root. Agents who had been buzzing with energy now sat slumped in chairs, staring blankly at screens. Sheriff Jenkins was on the phone, coordinating a wider, less hopeful grid search with local authorities. Detective Reed stood before the large topographical map, her posture rigid, her gaze sweeping over the endless green and brown contours of the mountains, as if trying to force a location to reveal itself through sheer willpower. They were out of leads. The trail had gone cold again, and this time it felt final. The ticking clock had become a slow, mocking dirge. Nick could feel the encroaching darkness of failure as keenly as anyone. It was a familiar feeling, a cold companion from his past. He couldn't stand the sterile, hopeless atmosphere of the command unit. He needed to touch the problem, to see it with his own eyes, not through a computer screen. "I need to see the evidence photos again," he said to Reed, his voice quiet but firm. "Everything from the cabin." Reed nodded, gesturing to a tablet on the table. Nick picked it up and retreated to a corner, sinking onto a small stool. Toby, sensing his handler's distress, left his spot by the door and came to lay his heavy head on Nick's knee, a warm, grounding pressure in the cold room. Nick swiped through the digital files, his eyes ignoring the obvious. He wasn't looking for another map or a written clue. He was looking for a mistake, a small detail, a single thread out of place. He scanned photos of the half-eaten oatmeal, the cot with the wooden bird, the sparse shelves of canned goods. His mind was a quiet, focused machine, filtering out the noise, searching for a signal. He stopped on a wide shot of the cabin's interior. It showed the main room, the table, the hearth. In the background, hanging from a rough, hand-driven peg on the wall, was a coil of rope. It was just a utility rope, something the initial search team had noted and dismissed. But Nick's eyes weren't on the rope itself. They were on the knot. He zoomed in, the image pixelating slightly, but still clear enough. It was the knot used to secure the coil for hanging. It was a taut-line hitch. A jolt went through him. It wasn't a common knot for a generalist. A simple slip knot would have done the job. A taut-line hitch was a friction hitch, an adjustable loop used to secure lines under tension, like a tent guy line or a tarp ridge line. It was a practical, specific, and incredibly useful knot. And it was a favorite among a certain group of people who spent their lives working in the woods. Park rangers, Forest Service workers, wilderness firefighters. They were taught to tie it until it was muscle memory. A survivalist like Jedediah might know it, but he would more likely use simpler, cruder knots for a simple task like hanging a rope. This knot was tied with a neat, practiced efficiency. It was a signature. "It's a ranger's knot," he whispered to himself. Toby's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. Nick's mind raced, a fire catching on dry tinder. A ranger's knot. He swiped frantically through the evidence files until he found another, seemingly insignificant photo. It was a close-up of a torn scrap of paper found in a trash bin. On it was a hastily scribbled list: flour, salt, batteries, and on the back, a single cryptic phrase: supplies for the high post. The team had dismissed it. High post could mean anything. It was too vague. But to Nick, it was no longer vague. It was a destination, a ranger's knot and a note about a high post. The two pieces clicked together in his mind with the force of a rifle shot. He stood up, the tablet in his hand, and walked over to the large topographical map where Detective Reed was still standing, her face a study in frustration. "They're not on the run," Nick said. Reed turned to look at him, her eyes questioning. "What are you talking about? Of course they are." "No," Nick insisted. "Running is reactive. They're not running. They've relocated to a final, defensible position, a place they prepared a long time ago." He held up the tablet, showing her the close-up of the knot. "This is a taut-line hitch. It's a ranger's knot. Jedediah didn't tie this. Someone with professional forestry training did." He then pointed to the evidence bag containing the scrap of paper. "Supplies for the high post." He turned back to the topographical map and raised his hand, his finger tracing the highest ridges. Where is the highest, most defensible point with a man-made structure in this entire sector? Reed's eyes followed his finger. She zoomed in on the digital map display. Her breath caught. There, marked with the symbol for a decommissioned structure, was a single point on the highest peak for 50 miles. Osprey Peak, she whispered. The old ranger station. It was decommissioned in the 1990s. It's a ruin. It's a fortress, Nick corrected her, his voice low and certain. It has a 360-degree view of every approach. It's nearly impossible to get up there without being seen. It is the perfect high post. The despair in the room evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. The scattered, hopeless team members gathered around the map, their faces illuminated by the projection, their exhaustion forgotten. The dead end had become a destination. Nick had found the final piece of the puzzle, not in a grand clue, but in a simple, perfectly tied knot. Detective Reed looked at the map, then at Nick, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something beyond respect in her eyes. It was awe. "Get me everything we have on that station," she commanded, her voice ringing with renewed authority. "Tactical teams, get ready to move. The race isn't over." Nick looked at the peak on the map, a sense of grim finality settling over him. This was the end game. The giant's castle had been a way station. This was the dragon's lair. The ascent to Osprey Peak was a silent vertical battle. They moved under the cover of a pre-dawn gloom, the air thin and bitingly cold. Every step was a calculated risk. The decommissioned ranger station sat at the highest point for miles, a silent sentinel that could spot any clumsy approach. The team, a small elite unit led by Reed and guided by Nick, moved like ghosts, using every rock and tree for cover, their breath misting and vanishing in the gray light. Nick felt a grim sense of homecoming. This stealth, this tension, this slow, deliberate advance on a high-value target. This was a language his body had never forgotten. They saw it first through binoculars. The station was a skeleton of its former self, a small square cabin on stilts, its wood weathered to a silver gray. But there were signs of life, subtle but clear. A new-looking stovepipe jutted from the roof, a pane of glass in one window had been replaced with plastic sheeting, and the path to the door, though faint, was clear of recent deadfall. Someone was here. They surrounded the structure, a tightening net of silent professionals. On Reed's signal, the team breached the main door with practiced efficiency. The sound of the door crashing open was swallowed by the immense silence of the mountaintop. Clear. The call came a moment later, laced with a sharp edge of confusion and disappointment. Nick and Reed entered. The single room was stark and empty, but the signs of recent occupation were everywhere. 2 sleeping bags lay on the floor, a pot of water sat on a small wood stove, and Robin's fantasy book, The Queen of Light, lay open on a small crate. But there was no one here. The crushing weight of another near miss, of being seconds too late, descended on the room. But outside, Toby was not calm. He had been posted with Nick to cover the rear of the station, and while the team was inside, the dog's focus had shifted. He wasn't watching the tree line. He was staring intently at the ground beneath the cabin, at a set of old, heavy wooden doors set almost flush with the earth, covered in moss and dead leaves. A storm cellar. A low whine started in Toby's chest. He began to pace, his nails scraping on the rock. He ignored Nick's quiet command to heel. His agitation was growing, his whining turning sharper. He scratched at the edge of the cellar doors, his focus absolute. Nick knelt beside him, placing a hand on his back. The dog was trembling. It wasn't the scent of a person that had him so agitated. Nick knew his dog's signals. This was the scent of pure, undiluted panic. He was smelling Robin's fear. "Sarah!" Nick's voice was a harsh whisper. "Down here, underneath." Reed and 2 agents were out in a flash. As they moved toward the cellar doors, they heard a muffled sound from within, the scraping of a bolt being drawn back. The door burst open with a surge of desperate energy. A young woman scrambled out, her face pale and her eyes wide with a cornered animal's frantic terror. She was maybe in her late 20s, with long, matted brown hair and a thin, wiry frame. This had to be Cassie Stone. And she was not alone. She was dragging a small, terrified child behind her by the arm. It was Robin. She was so small, smaller than Nick could have imagined. A thin, pale girl with huge, dark eyes that seemed to swallow the gray morning light. Her hair was lank, and her clothes were rough and ill-fitting. She stumbled out into the cold air, a fragile ghost made of skin and bone. And in that instant, Nick's world fractured. The Colorado mountaintop dissolved. The scent of pine vanished, replaced by the acrid smell of smoke and cordite. He wasn't looking at Robin Miller. He was looking at Anila, her face smudged with dust, her eyes wide with confusion in the chaotic moments before the blast. The two images, separated by more than a decade and half a world, merged into one unbearable, clarifying vision. Robin's terrified face was Anila's. Her small, frail body was Anila's. The hand gripping her arm was the chaos that was about to swallow her whole. And the voice that screamed inside Nick's head was primal. Not again. The past and present collided, not as a debilitating flashback, but as a surge of pure, cold purpose. All the grief, all the guilt, all the years of running from the ghost of Kandahar were channeled into this single, perfect moment of action. He moved. He didn't think. He simply reacted, his body remembering its old lethal grace. He was not an attacker, he was a shield. In two long strides, he crossed the space between them, placing his own body directly between Cassie and Robin. He didn't touch Cassie. He didn't even look at her. His entire focus was on the child. He created a living wall, a barrier of absolute resolve. The move was so swift, so unexpected, that it broke Cassie's momentum. In that split second of hesitation, the other agents were on her, subduing her with a swift, efficient takedown. She struggled for a moment, then went limp, her fight extinguished. Nick slowly knelt, making himself smaller, less threatening. He was still between Robin and the commotion, shielding her from the sight of Cassie being handcuffed. He didn't speak. He didn't reach for her. He just stayed there, a quiet, solid presence. Robin was frozen, her breathing coming in tiny, shallow gasps. Her eyes were locked on him, filled with a terror that had known no end for 2 years. Toby, released from his duty, approached slowly. He whined softly, a sound of profound sympathy, and lay down a few feet away, making no move to get closer, simply offering his calm presence. Nick finally found his voice. It was rough, thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "Robin," he said, the name a prayer. "It's over. You're safe now." For a long moment, she just stared. Then her face, a mask of terror for so long, began to crumble. Her lower lip trembled. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Then another. The small, frail body was racked with a silent sob, the first release of a grief held captive for 1,000 days. An agent came forward and gently wrapped a thick, warm tactical blanket around her shoulders. She flinched at the touch, but didn't pull away. The distant, rhythmic chop of a helicopter's rotors began to echo through the mountains, growing steadily louder. The medevac was coming. Help was coming. The Queen of Light, in the form of a haunted soldier, a faithful dog, and a team of determined agents, had finally broken through the walls of the Shadow King's castle. Nick remained kneeling, watching over her, a silent guardian. The war that had raged inside him for so long had finally, mercifully, gone quiet. The mission was complete. The world Robin returned to was a universe away from the one she had left. It was a world of soft beds, bright lights, and the strange, muted quiet of a hospital. But for a child whose senses had been recalibrated by 2 years of darkness and fear, the quiet hum of the hospital machinery was a roar, and the gentle touch of a nurse was a terrifying intrusion. She was housed in the pediatric wing of St. Mary's Hospital in Grand Junction, a silent, watchful little ghost in a room filled with colorful balloons and stuffed animals that seemed to mock the stark terror in her eyes. Her parents, Mark and Helen Miller, never left her side. They were specters themselves, their faces a roadmap of sleepless nights, unending grief, and now a disbelieving, fragile joy. Mark, a sturdy man who had looked 10 years older than his age since 2023, simply held his daughter's hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles as if to reassure himself she was real. Helen, the woman Robin had imagined as the Queen of Light, read to her in a soft, steady voice from the same books of fairy tales, trying to bridge the chasm of 2 lost years with the familiar magic of old stories. Robin did not speak, not to the kind-faced doctors, not to the child psychologist, and not to the law enforcement officers who needed her statement. She communicated only through the desperate grip she kept on her mother's arm, a silent, terrified plea not to be left alone. Nick and Tom Jenkins stood in the hallway, watching the heartbreaking tableau through a small window in the door. The hospital had forbidden any visitors except immediate family, a decision Nick understood completely. He had no place in that room. He was a rescuer, a soldier whose mission was complete. He was not a healer. Seeing Robin flinch away when a nurse entered the room was a sharp, painful reminder that taking a prisoner from the enemy was only the first, simplest part of the battle. The real war, the one fought inside the mind, was just beginning for her. Detective Reed joined them, her face etched with exhaustion but her eyes sharp. "Anything?" she asked, nodding toward the room. "She's not talking," Tom said heavily. "The docs say it could be weeks or months. We have to give her time." "Time is something we may not have," Reed countered, her voice low. "Jedediah Stone is lawyered up and silent. We need to know who his accomplice was, the one who tied that knot." She looked at Nick. "The one with the training." As if on cue, her phone buzzed. She listened for a moment, her expression hardening. "I'll be right there," she said, then looked at Nick and Tom. "That was the DA's office. Cassie Stone just asked to make a full statement." The interrogation room was a cold, gray box. Cassie Stone sat at the table, a shrunken, broken figure in an oversized orange jumpsuit. The frantic, cornered defiance she'd shown at the ranger station was gone, replaced by a hollow, shuddering guilt. Her confession tumbled out in a torrent of sobs and fragmented sentences, a story of manipulation, misplaced loyalty, and terrible, cascading mistakes. She told them about her uncle Jedediah, how his grief over losing his own son to a drug overdose years ago had curdled into a fanatical hatred of the modern world. She was all the family he had left, and his powerful, persuasive philosophy had become the center of her world. "But it wasn't his idea," Cassie choked out, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Not really. He had the anger, the why, but he didn't have the how. She gave him that." "She?" Reed prompted gently. "Who is she, Cassie?" "Sarah," Cassie whispered. "Sarah Evans." The name hung in the air. A quick search on a laptop brought up a file. Sarah Evans, 39, a brilliant botanist with a master's degree from Colorado State. She had worked for the U.S. Forest Service as a conservation officer for 7 years, based right here in Pine Ridge. She had resigned 5 years ago. "Why, Cassie?" Reed asked. "Why would a respected scientist get involved in this?" Cassie's story then turned to the heart of the tragedy. Sarah, she explained, had been a passionate, dedicated officer who loved the mountains more than anything. She had a husband and a 6-year-old daughter. They were her whole world. 6 years ago, they were driving back from a camping trip when their car was hit head-on by a drunk driver who had 17 prior offenses. Her husband and daughter were killed instantly. "She broke," Cassie said, her voice a ghost of a whisper. "The man who did it got out of jail in 3 years. Sarah saw it as a symptom of the whole world's disease. Jedediah found her in that grief. He didn't offer her comfort. He offered her a reason. He told her it wasn't just a drunk driver who killed her family. It was the whole sick, broken world that let him keep driving. And he offered her a way to fight back." The final terrible piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Sarah Evans, with her intimate professional knowledge of the backcountry, had become the architect of their plan. She was the one who knew about the decommissioned mine. She was the one who had helped Jedediah fortify the old hunting cabin. She was the one who knew the abandoned ranger station on Osprey Peak was the perfect, untouchable fortress. She was the brains, the strategist, the one who tied the ranger's knot. Jedediah was the voice, but Sarah was the hands. "Where is she now?" Reed's voice was cold steel. "She has a place," Cassie said, her body trembling. "A small research cabin, off-grid, near the Uncompahgre National Forest. It's where she went when things got too loud. It's where she was supposed to go after we left the station." The manhunt was swift and silent. Armed with the location from Cassie, a tactical team was dispatched by helicopter. Within 2 hours, they were surrounding a small, unassuming cabin nestled in a remote valley. Nick, Reed, and Toby were on that helicopter. Nick had insisted. He needed to see the end of it, to look the final architect of Robin's prison in the eye. There was no siege, no confrontation. The team breached the door to find Sarah Evans sitting at a simple wooden table, a cup of cold tea in front of her. A detailed topographical map of the region was spread out before her. She wasn't looking at it. She was just staring at the wall. She was an ordinary-looking woman, with short, practical brown hair and intelligent, observant eyes. But those eyes were utterly hollow, burned out by a grief so profound it had become a fire that consumed everything else. She looked at the armed agents who filled her cabin with a kind of weary resignation. The game was over. She didn't resist as they put her in handcuffs. Her face was a blank mask. As she was led out of the cabin, her gaze fell on Nick. For a moment, their eyes met. He saw no remorse in them, no flicker of guilt. He saw only the vast, empty wilderness of a soul that had lost its way, a grief that had metastasized into a terrible, cold fury. Watching her being led to the helicopter, Nick understood. Jedediah was the ideologue, Cassie was the coerced muscle, but Sarah was the true tragedy. She was the brilliant mind, shattered by loss, and remade into an instrument of the very cruelty she believed she was fighting. The 3 points of the dark triangle were now in custody. The network, built on madness, manipulation, and grief, had finally collapsed. 6 months had passed. 6 months for the seasons to turn, for the snows to fall upon the high peaks, and then retreat, feeding the creeks that Robin once called trails of fear. 6 months for the quiet, methodical machinery of justice to run its course. The trial was over. The media had packed up their vans and left Pine Ridge to its enduring silence. Jedediah Stone and Sarah Evans, unrepentant to the last, were sentenced to spend the remainder of their lives in prison, their twisted philosophies finally confined to concrete walls. Cassie Stone, whose tearful testimony had been crucial, received a lesser sentence, the court acknowledging the deep manipulation she had endured. The legal chapter was closed, but for the people whose lives had been irrevocably altered, the story was far from over. Life had returned to a semblance of normal, but it was a new normal, forever changed by the events that had unfolded. The town of Pine Ridge breathed a little easier, but the mountains were now viewed with a different kind of respect, a deeper awareness of the secrets they could hold. And in his cabin, Nick Miller was no longer a ghost. The Spartan solitude of his home had been softened by small, almost imperceptible changes. A vibrant, crayon-drawn picture of a gray dog and a bearded man was held to his refrigerator by a magnet. A high-quality bag of dog treats, a gift from Robin's parents, sat on the counter. His quiet routine, once a defensive wall against the world, now included regular visits from the Miller family. The silence in his cabin was no longer the silence of isolation, but the silence of peace. The healing had been a slow, delicate process. After Robin had come home from the hospital, Nick had kept his distance, understanding that his presence might be a reminder of the rescue, of the trauma. He sent messages through Tom, checking in, asking for updates. Then one day, Mark Miller had shown up at his door, his face etched with gratitude. "She asked about you," Mark had said, his voice thick. "She asked about the man with the gray dog. She's still not talking much, but she asked." And so the visits began. They were quiet at first. Nick would come over and sit on the Miller's porch while Robin played in the yard, with Toby lying calmly on the grass, a reassuring, watchful presence. He never pushed her to speak. He simply existed in her space, a safe, steady figure. The day she had walked over and silently offered Toby her favorite toy was a victory greater than any medal Nick had ever earned. 3 months ago, on a cool summer evening, Mark and Helen had asked him to be Robin's godfather. Nick, a man who had cut himself off from all meaningful human connection, was stunned into silence. I'm not that kind of man," he had stammered. Helen, her eyes shining with tears, had put her hand on his arm. "Nick," she'd said, "you are exactly that kind of man." Today they were on the trail together. Not a treacherous creek bed or a steep, dangerous ascent, but a wide, sun-dappled path that followed the gentle curve of a laughing stream. Robin, now a confident 10-year-old, walked just ahead, her hand occasionally resting on Toby's thick fur. The terror that had haunted her eyes had receded, replaced by a quiet curiosity. She was still a reserved child, and the scars of her ordeal ran deep, but the light was returning. Nick had made a promise to himself. He would not teach her about survival, about snares and shelters, and the harsh realities of the wild. The mountains had been her prison. He would not let them become a place of fear and pragmatism. He would teach her their magic instead. "Stop for a minute, Robin," he said softly. "Close your eyes." She trusted him enough to obey. She stood in the middle of the path, her small face tilted up toward the sun. "Just listen," he said. "Don't think. Just listen. Tell me what you hear." Toby sat at her feet, his tail giving a slow, gentle thump against the dirt. Robin was silent for a long moment. "The water," she whispered, her eyes still closed. "It sounds like it's talking." "It is," Nick affirmed. "What else?" "A bird, the one that pecks the trees." "A woodpecker," he supplied. "He's looking for his lunch." "What else?" "The wind," she said, a small smile touching her lips. "It sounds different in the pine trees than it does in the aspen trees. It's a lower sound in the pines." "A whisper?" Nick smiled too. "That's right. You're listening. You're hearing the mountain's real voice." He was teaching her to reclaim the wilderness, not by conquering it, but by becoming a part of its peace. He was helping her replace the memories of a cold, dark cave with the warmth of the sun on her face, the sound of a roaring fire with the gentle music of a stream. Each walk, each lesson in listening, was another layer of good memory placed over the bad. They reached a small clearing that overlooked the valley, a panorama of green and gold stretching out below them. Robin sat on a large sun-warmed boulder, and Toby immediately rested his head on her lap. She stroked his ears, her movements gentle and sure. Nick stood behind them, looking out at the vast landscape. He thought of Kandahar. He thought of Anila. The memory no longer came with the sharp, stabbing pain of guilt. It was a gentle ache now, a profound and lasting sorrow, but it no longer had the power to break him. He hadn't been able to save her, but the ghost of that failure had driven him into the woods on that fateful day. It had led him to Toby, to the mine, to Robin. He hadn't saved Anila, but he had honored her memory in the most powerful way he could. He had saved this child. He had created a bright future, where before there was only darkness. "Nick?" Robin's voice was small but clear. "I'm here." "The mountains don't feel scary today," she said, still looking out at the view. "That's because you're not their prisoner anymore," he said. "You're their friend." She looked up at him, her eyes clear and full of a wisdom no child should have to possess. "Because you and Toby are here?" she corrected him gently. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he had long thought was lost to him forever. He was no longer a ghost in his own life. He was a godfather, a protector, a friend. He sat down on the rock beside her. The three of them sat in a comfortable silence, a small, resilient family forged in tragedy and healed by patience and love. The sun was warm on their faces. The wind whispered through the pines. Below them, Pine Ridge was bathed in the golden light of a perfect autumn afternoon. After a while, they stood up and began the walk back down the trail, with Toby trotting happily between them. Nick watched Robin skip ahead to chase a butterfly, her laughter echoing through the trees. He and Toby, two old soldiers, had long ago finished their war. But they had finally found their peace, not in solitude, but on this quiet patch of earth they had chosen to protect. The bond between a veteran and their dog is a silent promise, a quiet vow to help heal the wounds that no one else can see. Nick and Toby's journey is a powerful reminder that sometimes in the mission to save another soul, we end up rescuing ourselves. If their story of loyalty and redemption touched your heart, we would be honored to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Liking and sharing this video helps their tale find others who may need it, and subscribing ensures you will always be a part of our storytelling community. A new journey is already waiting for you. Just click on the video that has now appeared on your screen.